The dress was the color of ripened wheat. Alice had spent 3 nights sewing it by candlelight, using thread borrowed from Sarah and fabric she had saved for over 4 weeks of service in the banquet hall of Alder's stronghold. It was not silk. It was not velvet. It was fine linen, the best she could reach. But the hands that had sewn it knew every stitch, every fold, every small decision that could transform something plain into something worthy. Sarah had told her, seeing her dressed and ready that afternoon, that she looked like a woman born to walk into a room and change it. Alice had smiled at that. She had wanted to believe it. She was 23 years old, a server in the great hall of the Alder Pack, a woman with no bloodline worth mentioning, and no rank that anyone would bother recording. Her father had been a low-ranking wolf who died before she could remember him, and her mother had worked the same hall before her, carrying pitchers of wine and plates of roasted meat for wolves whose names filled history and whose decisions shaped territories. Alice had grown up in the smell of wood smoke and tallow, in the noise of laughter that was never meant for her, in the particular silence of someone who learns early that her role is to serve, not to be seen. But tonight was the night of claiming. Once every 3 years, the great packs gathered at a neutral stronghold to conduct the claiming ceremony, a tradition older than most of the banners that hung in the hall. Alphas of age could declare their chosen mate before witnesses from every pack. It was a public act, a binding one, weighted with honor and consequence. To be claimed before the assembly was to be elevated. To be overlooked was simply to go home. Alice was not supposed to be standing at the edge of the great hall in a wheat-colored dress, hoping, but Owen had asked her to wait for him there. Owen Alder, second son of the Alder Pack's ruling family. Not the heir, not the most powerful wolf in the room, but someone who had noticed her 3 months ago when she had steadied a tray that slipped near his elbow, and he had looked at her, truly looked, not through her the way most of them did, and said her name like it was worth saying. He had come back to the hall the following week, and the week after that. He had brought her a small carved wooden fox one evening, setting it on the edge of the serving counter without ceremony, as though it meant nothing, though they both understood it meant something. He had told her, 12 days ago, standing in the corridor outside the kitchen with the smell of pine resin drifting through the stone window, that he would look for her at the claiming, that she should wear something that wasn't a uniform. So she had sewn the dress. She stood now near the eastern pillar of the great hall, holding a tray she no longer needed as a reason to be there. The hall was magnificent tonight. Torches set in iron sconces along every wall, their light catching the gold thread in the banners of 7 packs. Long tables ran the length of the room, loaded with roasted game, dark bread, clay pitchers of wine and mead. The smell was layered and thick. Smoke, meat, pine, the musky warmth of many wolves in an enclosed space. And underneath it all, something older, something that lived in stone and ceremony. The great wolves of the assembled packs were dressed in their finest, alphas in heavy mantles of fur and leather, their marking brands visible at their throats or wrists, their mates and families arranged around them like satellites. Pack elders at the high table, silver-haired and watchful. Younger wolves moving between the groups, establishing connections, performing the careful choreography of alliance. Alice watched all of it from her pillar. She watched for Owen. Sarah appeared at her elbow, shorter, dark-haired, with quick eyes that missed nothing. She had been Alice's closest companion since childhood, another server's daughter who had grown up in these same halls. She looked at Alice's face, and then out at the room, and then back again. "He's here," Sarah said quietly. Alice found him immediately. Owen stood near the center of the hall with 3 other wolves from his family, dressed in the alder deep green, his dark hair combed back from his face. He was laughing at something one of his brothers had said. He had not yet looked in her direction. That was fine. The ceremony had not begun. She waited. The claiming began when the Elder of Alder struck the great bell 3 times, and the noise of the room shifted into a charged, expectant quiet. Alphas who intended to claim stepped forward one by one before the assembly, speaking the name of their chosen, and the chosen stepped forward in return. It was simple. It was ancient. It carried the full weight of every wolf in that hall as witness. 3 alphas claimed their mates. 3 women stepped forward from the crowd, some smiling, one with tears running down her face, all of them walking toward the wolf who had spoken their name into the silence as though the name itself were a declaration of territory. Alice's hands tightened on the tray. Owen was moving. He stepped away from his family's cluster and walked toward the open space before the elders' table. Alice felt something rise in her chest. Something warm and frightened and hopeful all at once. The feeling of a door about to open. She thought of the carved wooden fox sitting on the windowsill of the small room she shared with Sarah. She thought of the way he had said her name in the corridor. She thought, "This is it." Owen stopped before the elder. He opened his mouth. "Isolde of the Greymere Pack," he said clearly. "I claim you." The silence in Alice's chest was different from the silence in the room. The room's silence broke immediately into murmurs, into the quiet approval of those who recognized the political weight of a union between Alder and Greymere. Alice's silence was something else. It was the particular stillness of a person who has just had the floor disappear beneath her feet and has not yet fallen. A tall woman with copper hair stepped out from the Greymere cluster. She was beautiful in a deliberate, assembled way. Her dress dark red, her chin lifted. She walked toward Owen, and he extended his hand, and they stood together before the elder as though it had always been arranged. Because it had, Alice understood now. It had always been arranged, and she had simply not known. The carved wooden fox meant nothing. The corridor meant nothing. She had built an entire small world out of nothing, and it had just been dissolved in 10 words spoken by a man who had never once said her name in public. She set the tray down on the edge of the nearest table. Carefully. She would not drop it. She would not make a sound that drew attention to herself, would not give anyone in this hall the image of a server girl crumpling in public because a man she had no claim to had chosen someone else. She turned and walked toward the side corridor that led to the servants' passage. She had almost reached the archway when she heard it. Not a voice. A shift. The kind of shift that happened when something with genuine weight entered a room. The torches seemed to pull slightly, the way they did in a strong wind, though there was no wind. The murmur of the assembly changed register entirely, dropping into something low and startled and instinctively alert. Alice stopped. Every wolf in the room had turned toward the main entrance, standing in the great doorway, unhurried, as though the assembly of 7 packs was simply a room he had chosen to enter, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall in a way that reorganized the space around him. Black braids pulled back from a face that was all angles and stillness, pale eyes catching the torchlight with an eerie steadiness. He wore leather and fur, dark, unadorned. The harness across his chest buckled with plain iron, rather than the decorated clasps of the pack nobles, and he wore it the way stone wears its own weight, without effort, without awareness, simply as the thing it is. Behind him, 2 others stepped through the doorway. All 3 of them were looking at Alice. She told herself she was imagining it. 3 wolves of obvious power standing in the entrance of a great hall filled with pack nobles and alphas. They were not looking at her. They were looking at the room. They were surveying the assembly the way men of authority always did upon entering a space, calculating exits and presences and hierarchies in the automatic way that high-ranking wolves learned before they learned anything else. Alice was simply standing in their line of sight, a server in a wheat-colored dress who had been foolish enough to stop walking when she should have kept moving. She turned back toward the archway. Wait. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried in the way that a stone dropped into still water carries, not by force, but by the particular quality of its weight. The room did not go silent because the man had shouted. The room went silent because every wolf in it recognized, on some instinctive level beneath thought and rank and social performance, that the voice belonged to something they did not outrank. Alice stopped again. Her hand was 2 inches from the stone edge of the archway. She turned slowly. The man with the black braids was walking toward her. Not quickly, not with the urgent, covering stride of someone crossing a room with purpose, but with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never needed to rush because nothing had ever left before he was ready for it to stay. Behind him, the 2 others remained near the entrance, watching with expressions that Alice could not immediately read. The entire assembly watched in silence. Owen watched. Isolde of the Greymere pack watched, her copper hair catching the torchlight. The pack elders at the high table watched without expression, which was, Alice understood dimly, its own kind of expression. The man stopped 4 feet from her. Up close, the stillness was even more pronounced. Most wolves, even calm ones, even controlled ones, carried a kind of physical restlessness, a low hum of energy that expressed itself in small movements, the shift of weight, the flex of a jaw, the micro-adjustments of a body that was always partly prepared to move. This man was simply still, not rigid, not tense. Still in the way that very old, very large things were still. Mountains, deep water, the stone foundations of a hall that had stood for 3 centuries. His eyes were the color of glacial ice, pale and clear and deeply attentive. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. It was an observation delivered with the same neutral precision as a man noting weather. Alice met his eyes because she had been raised to meet the eyes of whoever she was addressing, regardless of their rank, and because something in her, the part that had sewn a dress by candlelight for 3 nights and carried it here on the back of a hope that had just been extinguished, refused to look at the floor. "I was," she said. "Why?" The word fell into the silence of the hall with extraordinary weight. Around them, no one moved. Alice was acutely aware of the 100 pairs of eyes fixed on this exchange. Aware of Owen somewhere behind her. Aware of Sarah pressed against the far wall with wide eyes. Aware of the elder at the high table leaning forward slightly in his carved chair. She considered lying. She considered saying she was simply returning to her duties, that she had a task in the kitchen, that she had never intended to stay for the ceremony at all. All of it would have been easier. All of it would have allowed her to disappear without anyone having to examine too closely the reason she had been standing at the eastern pillar in a dress that was not a uniform, holding a tray she did not need. Instead, she said, "I had no reason to stay." Something moved in his pale eyes. Not surprise. She did not think this man was surprised easily. Something more like recognition. The particular attentiveness of a wolf who has caught a scent that interests him. "Your name," he said. "Alice." "Pack?" "Alder," she said. And then, because it would come out regardless, server rank, no bloodline status. She said it without apology. She had learned long ago that apologizing for what you were only made the information worse, weighted it with shame it didn't necessarily deserve. She was a server. She had no status. These were facts in the same category as the color of her hair, or the particular way the hall smelled tonight. They simply were. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his head slightly and said something to the hall at large. Not loudly, but in the carrying way he seemed to do everything. Who dismissed her? The question detonated quietly in the assembly. Because it was framed that way, not why is she leaving, not what happened, but who dismissed her, as though her departure were an action someone had taken against her, an offense that had been committed rather than a choice she had made. Owen made a sound somewhere to Alice's left. It was not quite a word. The man turned toward the sound. His gaze found Owen with no difficulty, moving through the crowd with the directness of someone who did not need to search for things because things arranged themselves to be found. "You spoke her name 3 months ago," the man said. It was not a question. "You let her dress for this night. You let her stand in that hall and wait, and then you spoke another name." The silence had a texture now. It was the particular silence of a large group of people who are witnessing something they recognize as significant and are holding very still so as not to disrupt it. Owen's jaw was tight. He was not a cowardly man. Alice had never thought that of him. But he was a man who had just been addressed by someone whose authority he clearly felt and could not immediately identify, and that combination was making him very careful. "The choice of acclaiming is a wolf's own right," Owen said. His voice was steady. "No law." "I am not speaking of law," the man said. "Quiet. Final. I am speaking of what you did." It was a simple distinction. It landed in the hall like a blade set on stone. No drama, no flourish. Simply a thing placed where everyone could see it. Alice looked at this stranger who had stopped her at the archway and spoken her name into a hall of 7 packs, and said who dismissed her as though she were something worth the question. She felt something strange move through her. Not gratitude, not exactly, because gratitude implied she needed saving, and she did not think of it that way. It was something closer to the feeling of being seen after a long time of being looked through. Something that had been compressed very small in her chest for a long time shifted, just slightly, and the shift was uncomfortable because she had grown accustomed to the compression. One of the 2 men who had remained near the entrance walked forward now. He was broader than the first, with a jaw that suggested he had lost a fight or 2 and had not particularly minded, and his expression as he approached held a lopsided quality that was almost humor. "You're going to cause a territorial incident on an empty stomach," he said to the man with the braids, and then looked at Alice with open curiosity. "He does this. Walks into rooms and immediately identifies the most interesting problem." "Stellan," the man with the braids said. A single word, carrying patient warning. "I'm just saying she might want context," Stellan said pleasantly, "before you reorganize her entire evening." The 3rd man had not moved from the entrance. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching, and he had the quality of someone who was always slightly outside the frame of whatever was happening, observing with an intensity that the casual posture was designed to conceal. When Alice's eyes found his, he nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement, nothing more. "Who are you?" Alice asked. She asked it looking at the man with the braids, because he was clearly the one the question needed to be addressed to, and because she had already decided that whatever the answer was, she would receive it standing upright. The hall's silence shifted into something that suggested most of the people in it felt this was perhaps a question whose answer she should already know. The alder elder made a small sound at the high table. Owen had gone very still. The man with the braids looked at her with those pale, attentive eyes. "Cassian," he said, "King of the Northern Packs." Alice absorbed this. The Northern Packs were not simply a territory. They were the oldest continuous wolf sovereignty on the continent. 7 generations of unbroken alpha rule, commanding more land and more wolves than the next 3 largest packs combined. The King of the Northern Packs did not attend interpack ceremonies. He sent representatives when he acknowledged other assemblies at all. His presence in a hall meant something that no one in the room had yet said aloud. "Why are you here?" she asked. Something happened at the edges of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the minimal movement of a man who very rarely smiled, but had just encountered something that moved him slightly in that direction. "I was passing through," he said. "And then I caught a scent." He said it simply, without ceremony. But every wolf in the hall understood what it meant when a wolf of Cassian's rank used that particular phrasing. A scent did not mean perfume or wood smoke or the smell of the feast. A scent meant something that stopped a wolf mid-motion, something rare, something that reached through all the layers of social performance and pack politics and deliberate self-control and found the animal underneath, which did not negotiate and did not compromise, and did not make decisions based on alliance or strategy. A scent meant her. Alice stood in her wheat-colored dress in the middle of the great hall of Alder's stronghold, with the torches burning and 7 packs watching, and the man she had sown 3 nights for standing somewhere behind her having chosen someone else. And she looked at the king of the northern packs and felt the particular vertigo of a life that had just changed directions without asking her permission. "I don't know what you want from me," she said. "I know," Cassian said. "That's why I'm going to tell you." He did not tell her there, in the middle of the hall. That, Alice thought, was the first indication that he was different from what she might have expected. A man announcing himself as king of the northern packs in a room full of assembled wolves, having just publicly called into question the conduct of a second son of the Alder family, could have made the next move a performance. He could have spoken his intentions into the silence where everyone would hear them, could have made her the center of a spectacle that was really about his power and not about her at all. Instead, he said, "There is a side chamber to the left of the elder's table. Will you walk with me?" Not a command, a question. The distinction was deliberate, and Alice felt every wolf in the room register it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." Stellan made a quiet sound behind them that might have been approval. The third man, the silent one at the door, straightened from the doorframe and moved to follow at a distance that suggested escort rather than intrusion. Alice walked beside Cassian through the parting crowd, and she was aware, very clearly, of the path opening before them. Wolves stepping back not from fear, exactly, but from the instinctive deference that a body gives to something it recognizes as categorically more powerful than itself. She had spent her entire life being the person who stepped back. The side chamber was a small room of dark stone, lit by 2 oil lamps on iron stands. A narrow table, 2 chairs, a window that looked out into the night forest. Pine trees pressing close to the stronghold walls, their shapes black against a sky thick with cloud. The smell in here was quieter. Stone and oil and the cold that came through old windows. Underneath that, something that Alice was only beginning to identify as the particular scent of the man beside her. Something like deep forest after rain, dark and clean, and very old. Cassian did not sit. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides, and looked at her with the same attentive stillness he had carried into the hall. "You're not afraid," he said. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "Most people probably have more to lose," Alice said. He considered that. "What do you think you have to lose?" She thought about the carved wooden fox on her windowsill. She thought about the wheat-colored dress and the 3 nights of candlelight and the particular quality of hope that lives in a person who has been invisible for a long time and believes briefly that someone has finally seen them. She thought about Owen's voice saying Isolde of the Greymere Pack with the clear, carried confidence of a man reading from a script he had memorized weeks ago. "Nothing I still have," she said. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been to 43 pack gatherings in 11 years of rule. I have attended ceremonies, negotiations, disputes, trials. I have walked into a great many halls." He paused. "I have never stopped walking for a scent." Alice held very still. "I want to be clear about what I am saying," he continued, in the same measured tone he seemed to use for everything, as though clarity were a form of respect he extended automatically. "I am not speaking of impulse. I am not speaking of a night's interest. When a wolf of my line recognizes a scent the way I recognized yours tonight, it is not a passing thing. My grandfather called it the bone knowing. The recognition that happens underneath every other layer of who you are. You don't know me," Alice said. "No," he agreed. "That is precisely why I am here rather than simply claiming you in the hall the way tradition would permit." He looked at her steadily. "I want to know you, and I want you to choose whether that is something you are willing to allow." The oil lamps moved slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, the pine trees shifted, and somewhere in the dark forest beyond the stronghold walls, something moved through undergrowth with the quiet confidence of a large animal that owned the night it moved through. Alice studied the man in front of her. The black braids, the pale eyes, the leather and iron, and the absolute absence of performance. She thought about what it meant that the king of the Northern Pax had walked into a gathering he had no obligation to attend, had stopped at the scent of a server with no bloodline and no status, and was now standing in a side chamber asking her permission to know her, instead of simply exercising the considerable authority he could have exercised in that hall without anyone raising a serious objection. "Why did you say that to Owen?" she asked. "In the hall. You didn't have to." Something shifted in his expression. "He let you dress for him," Cassian said. "He let you carry hope for a night that he had already decided. That is not a small thing to do to someone." The pale eyes were very direct. "I said it because it was true, and because the wolves in that hall needed to hear it named." Alice felt the compression in her chest shift again, that strange, uncomfortable loosening of something she had held tightly for a very long time. "I am not looking for rescue," she said, and she meant it without hardness, simply as a fact about herself that she needed him to have. "I know," Cassian said. "I watched you walk toward that archway. You were not falling apart. You were leaving with everything intact." A pause. "That is not a woman who needs rescue. That is a woman who deserves to be chosen correctly." The silence between them was different from the silence in the hall. That silence had been the held breath of an audience. This silence was something two people made together when neither of them had anything false left to say. From beyond the chamber door, Alice could hear the reassembling noise of the great hall, voices finding their register again, the clink of cups, the elder's bell signaling the continuation of the ceremony. The world outside this room was reorganizing itself around what had just happened, and Alice understood that when she walked back through that door, she would be walking into a different version of everything she had known. She was not sure she was ready for that. She was not sure it mattered whether she was ready. "Tell me about the Northern Pax," she said. Cassian looked at her. Then he moved to the chair near the table and sat, settling into it with the ease of a man who occupied space without requiring it to accommodate him, and he told her. He told her about the territory, 7 days' ride north of Alderlands, where the forests were old enough that their canopies blocked the sky, and the rivers ran so cold and clear you could see the stones on the bottom in winter. He told her about the stronghold, Vorenhold, built into a cliff face by his great-great-grandmother because she had said a home built into the earth could not be taken from you the way a home built on it could. He told her about the 7 sub-packs that owed fealty to the Northern Throne, each with their own bloodlines and traditions, held together not by fear, he was precise about this, but by a compact renewed by every king and every pack elder at the start of each reign. He spoke without embellishment. He spoke the way someone spoke who had no need to impress, who was simply answering a question honestly because the person who asked it deserved an honest answer. Alice sat in the other chair and listened, and she found that the listening was easy, that his voice had a quality she had not expected. Not soft, exactly, but without edges, without the need to dominate the air it moved through. She had spent her life in the company of wolves who used their voices as instruments of rank. This was different. When he finished, he said, "Now tell me about you." "I already told you everything," Alice said. "Server rank, no bloodline, Alder pack by residence, not by blood." "That is what you are called in their records," Cassian said. "I asked about you." She looked at him. "What do you do when the hall is empty?" he asked. "What do you know that no one thought to ask you? What are you good at that no one in that hall has ever had reason to notice?" Alice was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, she told him. She told him about the herbs she had learned to identify in the forest at the edge of the stronghold grounds, how she had taught herself to read the pack's old remedy books in the evenings when the kitchen was closed, how she had quietly taken over the treatment of minor wounds among the serving staff, because the pack healer charged more than any of them could afford. She told him about the maps she had memorized out of boredom, and the pack histories she had read cover to cover in the library that no one thought to restrict her from, because no one imagined she would go there. She told him about her mother, who had worked this hall before her, who had been quiet and capable and never once bitter, who had died 2 winters past of a cold that took hold because she would not stop working long enough for it to release her. She told him about Sarah, who was probably watching the door to this chamber from across the hall with her arms crossed and her sharp eyes calculating. Cassian listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, without interruption, without the particular restlessness of a person waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished, the oil lamps had burned lower. Outside, the forest was very dark and very quiet. "Your mother worked this hall her whole life," Cassian said, "and you have done the same, and you believe that is what you are." It was not quite a question. "It's what I've always been," Alice said. "Then you have been seen by the wrong eyes," he said simply. "For a very long time." Before Alice could answer, the chamber door opened. Stellan leaned in with the expression of a man delivering information he found genuinely interesting. "The Alder Elder is requesting the king's presence in the hall," he said. "Apparently several pack alphas are asking questions about your arrival that the Elder cannot answer to everyone's satisfaction." He paused. "Also, the Greymere Alpha looks like he wants to say something and hasn't worked up to it yet, which, based on experience, is usually worse than when they just say the thing." Cassian rose from his chair. He looked at Alice, and in the low lamplight, his expression held something that had not been there when he first stopped her at the archway. Something quieter, more careful, as though he had come into the evening expecting to pass through, and had found instead something he would need to think about for a long time. "Will you come back into the hall?" he asked. Alice thought about the wheat-colored dress, about the 3 nights of sewing, about Owen's voice reading a name that was not hers. She stood up. "Yes," she said. What she did not know, what none of them in that small stone chamber knew yet, was that while they had been talking, 30 wolves had quietly surrounded Varenhold's advance riders outside the stronghold walls, that a message was already moving through the assembly, that the reason the Greymere Alpha had not yet said what he wanted to say was because what he wanted to say was going to change everything about the night. She walked back through the door into the torchlight. The hall had reorganized itself in the way that halls do when something significant has entered them, and not yet resolved. The feast had resumed on the surface. Cups were being refilled. Conversations were happening at the long tables. But underneath all of it ran a current of attention that had not been there before Cassian walked through the main entrance. Alice felt it the moment she stepped back into the torchlight. Eyes moving to her, and then away, then back again, with the particular quality of people recalibrating something they thought they had already understood. Sarah was at her side within seconds. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked quietly, falling into step beside her, with the practiced ease of someone who had been navigating this hall since childhood. "Yes," Alice said. "The Northern King spoke to you for—" Sarah glanced toward the chamber door. "A long time." "He did." Sarah looked at her with the expression she reserved for moments when Alice was being technically truthful and comprehensively uninformative. "Alice." "I'll tell you everything later," Alice said. "What's happening in the hall?" Sarah's expression shifted into something more serious. "The Greymere Alpha arrived at the Elders' table about 20 minutes ago. He's been speaking with the Elders from 3 other packs since then. No one knows what about, but—" She paused. "His wolves are not inside the hall anymore. I counted at least 8 who slipped out through the side doors during the last hour." Alice absorbed this. Where did they go? That's what no one knows. Cassian had already moved toward the elders' table. Stellan at his left shoulder, and the silent third man, whose name Alice still did not know, positioned slightly behind and to the right, a placement that was either protective or strategic, and was probably both. The crowd parted for them with the same instinctive deference Alice had watched on the way in, and she noticed now what she had not fully registered before: that every wolf in the room was reading Cassian's presence, the way wolves read weather, trying to determine what it meant for them specifically, what shelter they needed to find, or what ground they needed to hold. The Greymere Alpha met them before they reached the elders' table. He was a large man, gray at the temples, with the particular solidity of a wolf who had held authority long enough that it had become structural rather than performed. His name was Edric, and Alice knew him by reputation as a careful politician, someone who moved slowly, built alliances through accumulation rather than confrontation, and rarely said anything in public that he had not already arranged the consequences of. He did not look careful now. He looked like a man who had made a decision that he was committed to and was carrying the weight of that commitment in his jaw. "Cassian," he said. His voice was neutral in the way that neutral voices sometimes carried more warning than openly aggressive ones. "I think there is a matter we should discuss privately before—" "There is no private matter between our packs that requires my riders to be surrounded," Cassian said. The hall went very quiet. Edric's expression did not change. "A precaution," he said. "Nothing more. The Northern King arrives unannounced at an assembly he was not invited to, makes public statements about the conduct of another pack's member, and spends an hour in a closed chamber with a—" He stopped, recalibrated slightly. "With a member of the Alder serving staff. You'll understand that questions arise." "What questions?" Cassian asked. "About your intentions," Edric said. "About what you are doing here. The Northern Packs have not attended an interpack assembly in 11 years. Your presence tonight is— My presence tonight is my own," Cassian said, "as is my interest in this pack's people. Neither requires the Greymere Alpha's permission or his wolves surrounding my riders in the dark." Edric looked at him steadily. Then his gaze moved, briefly, but unmistakably, to Alice. There it was. Alice had felt it coming. The moment when whatever this was stopped being about Cassian and Edric and pack politics and became explicitly about her, about the inconvenient fact of a server girl with no bloodline standing in the middle of a territorial dispute she had not asked to be part of. "The girl," Edric said carefully, "is not what she appears to be." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences of the evening. It had a specific texture, the texture of information arriving that several people in the room had been waiting for, and several others had not known was coming. Alice looked at Edric. "What does that mean?" He looked at her, genuinely looked, with an attention that felt different from how wolves of his rank usually looked at her, which was either through her or past her. "It means," he said, "that I knew your mother." Alice went still. "Maren of the Stonewild Pack," Edric said. His voice had lost some of its political edges. Something else was in it now. "She left Stonewild 24 years ago. She came here, took a server's position, changed her name. She never told anyone." He paused. "The Stonewild Pack has been looking for her descendants since her death." The hall had compressed into a kind of concentrated attention that Alice could feel on her skin. "Stonewild," Cassian said. It was not a question, but it had the quality of something being confirmed. "The old line," Edric said. "Maren was the last daughter of the Stonewild founding bloodline. She ran from an arranged binding she had not consented to. She hid herself well." He was still looking at Alice. "But blood does not hide." "Not entirely. Not forever." Alice's mind was moving through this information slowly, carefully, the way you move through unfamiliar terrain in low light. Her mother, Maren, who had worked this hall her whole life, who had been quiet and capable and never once bitter, who had taught Alice to read the old books and identify the forest herbs and hold herself straight regardless of who was watching, who had never spoken about where she came from, not once, not even at the end. "What does that mean for me?" Alice asked. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "It means," Edric said, "that you carry the founding blood of Stonewild, which means you have standing, legitimate, ancient standing." He paused again. "It also means that 2 of the packs I speak for tonight had claimed prior interest in that bloodline before your mother disappeared. That interest does not expire." "She is not a bloodline," Cassian said. His voice was quiet and very clear. "She is a person." Edric turned to him. "With respect, the law of prior bloodline claim does not apply," Cassian said, "to a woman who was never party to it and never consented to it. You know this." "The elders will decide what applies," Edric said carefully. "Then let them decide," Cassian said, "in the hall, in front of every pack assembled here. Let them hear the full account, your wolves surrounding my riders, your invocation of a claim against a woman who did not know she was claimed, your timing, which is curious given that this woman's status became relevant to you approximately 1 hour after the king of the northern packs took an interest in her." He looked at Edric with those pale, attentive eyes. "Let the elders hear all of it." Edric was quiet for a long moment. The political calculation was visible, just barely, beneath his careful expression. The assessment of what exposure looked like versus what concession looked like, and which of those was more recoverable. Before he could speak, a commotion moved through the far end of the hall. The side door that Sarah had mentioned, the one through which the Greymere wolves had slipped, opened hard. One of Cassian's riders came through it, a young wolf with road dust still on his coat and a cut along his jaw that had not been there an hour ago. He crossed the hall without looking at anyone except Cassian, stopped before him, and spoke in a low voice. Alice watched Cassian's face. She had been watching his face for the better part of 2 hours now, and she had learned that it was not an expressive face. It communicated through very small signals, the kind you had to be paying close attention to catch. What moved across it now was not anger. It was something colder and more deliberate than anger. It was the expression of a man who had suspected something, and had just been told he was right. He turned to the hall. "My riders," he said, in the carrying voice that did not need to be loud, "were stopped outside your walls. 3 of them were restrained. 1 was struck." He looked at the assembled wolves, all of them, the full sweep of 7 packs. "I want to be precise about what I am saying. I arrived at this gathering in peace, without riders armed for conflict, because I had no cause to expect conflict. I found something unexpected here." His gaze moved briefly to Alice. "And I chose to remain. In that time, wolves outside this hall took action against my people." He turned to Edric. "I am not going to make this a war," he said. "That is my choice, not yours, and I want you to understand the difference. I am choosing not to make this a war, because I did not come here for one, and because the wolves in this hall do not deserve the consequence of your decision." A pause. "But my riders will be released and attended to, and your wolves who restrained them will present themselves to the elders' table before this assembly closes. Those are not negotiating points." Edric looked at him for a long moment. 30 wolves against 3 riders. That had been the calculation. The overwhelming force of Greymere numbers against a king who had arrived with a small escort, unprepared, interested in a server girl rather than in territory or politics. What Edric had not calculated, what was visible now in the way the assembled wolves were watching, in the way even his own allied pack alphas had gone very still, was that numbers were not the only measure of force, that a king who stood in a hall with a cut writer's report and chose precision over rage, chose witness over war, chose the particular authority of a man who did not need to shout because everything he said landed with the weight of someone who had never had to repeat himself. That king was not outnumbered. He was simply in a room full of people who had just understood, all at once, that they had miscalculated. Stellan had moved to Alice's left at some point during this exchange, and she became aware of him standing there, with his arms loose at his sides, and his expression pleasantly neutral, in the way that suggested the pleasantness was a choice, and the neutrality was a skill. "You all right?" he said quietly. "You keep asking me that," Alice said. "You keep being in the middle of things," Stellan said. From across the hall, through the noise of the reassembling conversation, Alice found Sarah's eyes. Sarah was standing near the far wall with her hands clasped in front of her, and her expression held something that Alice recognized after a moment as fierce, quiet pride. The expression of someone watching a person they love receive something they had always deserved, and feeling the ache of all the years it took to arrive. Alice looked back at Cassian. He was speaking to the elder now, measured and precise, the full account laid out without embellishment. And Alice watched the elder listen, and the other pack alphas listen, and the hall settle into the particular quiet of a group of people being asked to witness something, and taking that responsibility seriously. She thought about her mother, about Marin of the Stonewild pack, who had run from a claim she had not consented to and hidden herself in plain sight for decades, who had raised her daughter in the smell of wood smoke and tallow, and taught her to read old books and hold herself straight, who had never told her, who had, Alice thought, perhaps been waiting for a moment when it would not be a burden to know. She reached into the pocket of her wheat-colored dress and found it there, the carved wooden fox from Owen, which she had put in her pocket tonight without knowing why, some old habit of carrying small things that mattered. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she set it quietly on the edge of the nearest table and left it there. She did not look back at it. The elder's decision came before the torches burned low. It was not a complicated ruling. The elder of Alder, a silver-haired wolf named Corvin, who had presided over more interpack disputes than anyone in the hall cared to count, stood at the high table and spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing words that could not be easily argued with later. He said that the invocation of a prior bloodline claim against a woman who had been unaware of her lineage, timed to coincide with the expressed interest of a visiting sovereign, did not meet the conditions required for the claim to be considered active under the old compact. He said that Cassian's riders would be released and attended to before the assembly closed, and that the Greymere wolves responsible for the restraint would be named before witnesses. He said that Alice, daughter of Marin of Stonewild, carried founding blood that was hers to understand, and hers to act on according to her own will, and that no pack present had standing to direct what that meant for her life. He said all of this carefully, precisely, in a voice that left no useful gaps. Edric received the ruling without visible reaction, which was the reaction of a man who had been in enough rooms to know when a position was no longer recoverable, and had decided that composure was the only remaining currency. He inclined his head to the elder. He inclined it, slightly less deeply, to Cassian. He did not look at Alice, which she found she did not mind at all. Owen was standing near the Alder family cluster, when Alice finally looked at him directly for the first time since the ceremony. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who had made what seemed like a reasonable calculation, and was now watching the full shape of what he had failed to account for become visible all at once. He took a step toward her. Alice looked at him steadily, and he stopped. Not because she said anything. Not because anyone stepped between them. Simply because something in her face told him, clearly and without cruelty, that there was nothing useful in that direction anymore. That the door he had closed was not a door she was standing behind waiting for him to open it again. He stepped back. She turned away. Cassian was at her side. He did not say anything immediately. They stood together near the eastern pillar, the same pillar where she had waited for a man who had already made his choice, and the hall moved around them, the assembly beginning its slow dissolution into smaller conversations, packs gathering their people, the evening finding its end. "The Stonewild Pack," Alice said. "Tell me what you know about them." "Old bloodline," Cassian said. "Northern border, originally. They lost their territory in a dispute 4 generations ago and merged with the Ashvin Pack. The founding lineage was tracked but dormant." He paused. "Your mother was right to run from the binding they had arranged for her. Stonewild's elder at that time was not a careful man. Is he still the elder?" "He died 12 years ago. The current elder is his granddaughter. She is careful." He looked at Alice. "She will want to know about you. What you do with that is yours to decide." Alice absorbed this. Her mother had carried a secret for decades, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation, and she had carried it so completely that she had taken it with her when she died. Alice felt the grief of that, not newly, because she had been grieving her mother for 2 winters already, but differently. With more context now. With the particular sadness of understanding a choice that had been made before you were there to be consulted. "She protected me," Alice said. Not to Cassian specifically. To the stone pillar, to the torchlight, to the hall that smelled of smoke and pine, and the last hours of a feast. "Yes," Cassian said simply. Sarah appeared with 2 cups of wine, and the expression of a woman who had decided that the evening warranted it. She handed one to Alice and looked at Cassian with the direct, assessing gaze she turned on anything she was trying to take the full measure of. "You stopped her at the archway," Sarah said to him. It was not quite an accusation, and not quite a compliment. "I did," Cassian said. "She was leaving with her dignity intact," Sarah said. "That was not easy, and it was not small." "I know," he said. "I watched her do it." Sarah looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Alice with an expression that said, in the wordless language of people who have known each other since childhood, "I see it. I still have questions. But I see it." She took her wine and moved back into the hall, which was Sarah's way of granting privacy, while remaining exactly close enough to intervene if needed. Alice almost smiled. "Your friend is protective," Cassian said. "She's the reason I'm still standing," Alice said, "most of the time." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, through the high, narrow windows of the great hall, the sky had shifted, the thick clouds breaking slightly, a cold stars showing through in patches. The forest beyond the walls was very still. "I need to ask you something," Alice said. "Ask." "The scent," she said. "The bone knowing. I understand what you said it means for you. What I need to know is—" She paused, finding the precise shape of what she was asking. "What does it require of me? Because I am not a wolf who makes decisions because something outside herself requires them. Not anymore." Cassian turned to look at her fully. In the torchlight, his pale eyes held the particular quality she had been trying to name all evening. Not cold, as she had first thought, but deep. The way still water looked cold when it was simply very clear. "It requires nothing of you," he said. "That is the honest answer. The bone knowing is something that happens in me. It tells me that you are someone I will not be able to stop thinking about for the rest of my life. That your absence from whatever room I am in will feel like a specific and permanent wrongness. That I would rather spend the rest of my years learning who you are than spend them having already decided." He paused. "What it does not do is obligate you to feel the same. What it does not do is make your choice for you." Alice looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Why tell me that? You are a king. You have more authority in this hall tonight than any wolf here. You could have claimed me in front of the assembly the moment you decided the elder's ruling was in your favor. That is within your right. Why did you not? Because a claim made without your choice is not a claim, Cassian said. It is a possession. I am not interested in possessing you. I am interested in you. The distinction landed in Alice's chest and stayed there. She thought about her mother, who had run rather than be bound without consent. She thought about herself, 23 years old, no bloodline status, a server in a hall that had never been required to see her, standing in a wheat-colored dress at the end of an evening that had dismantled itself and rebuilt in a completely different shape. She thought about Varenhold, built into a cliff face by a woman who had said that a home built into the earth could not be taken from you. She thought about the 30 wolves who had surrounded 3 riders, and the king who had stood in the hall afterward and chosen precision over rage, chose witness over war, chose the particular authority of someone who did not need to destroy things to demonstrate what he was. I am not saying yes tonight, Alice said. I know, Cassian said. I need time. I need to understand my mother's history, and what the Stonewild bloodline means, and what I actually want, not what the evening has made feel urgent. She looked at him. I need to make this decision as myself, not as a woman who just had a terrible night and is standing next to the first person who has been genuinely kind to her in a long time. That is exactly the right way to make it, Cassian said. I am also not saying no, Alice said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, that minimal, almost smile she had seen once before in the side chamber. I know that too, he said. How? Because you are still standing here, he said simply. What followed did not happen quickly, because the things that matter rarely do. Alice spent 3 days at Alder's stronghold after the assembly, during which she sent a letter to the Stonewild Pack's current elder. A careful, precise letter that said she existed, that she knew who her mother had been, and that she was willing to correspond, but not yet to commit to anything further. The elder wrote back within the week. Her name was Vanya, and her letter was careful and honest, and asked for nothing Alice was not ready to give. They corresponded through the winter, and in the spring Alice traveled to the Stonewild territory. Not as a supplicant, not as a bloodline heir returning to fold herself into someone else's structure, but as herself, curious and clear-eyed and carrying her mother's quiet capability in every line of her. Sarah came with her, because Sarah went where Alice went, and because the world was large and neither of them had seen enough of it. Cassian sent no letters during those months. He had said he would not press, and he did not press. And Alice found that his absence was exactly what he had predicted it would be, a specific and present thing, a shape in the air, something she was aware of the way you were aware of a door left slightly open in another room. Not urgent, not demanding, simply there. She arrived at Varenhold in early summer, unannounced, on a morning when the northern forest was green and loud with birds, and the cliff face that held the stronghold caught the early light and held it. Cassian met her in the main courtyard. He had been informed she was coming. His border wolves had seen her party 2 hours out, but he had not arranged a ceremony, or an assembly or any form of reception that would have required her to perform her arrival. He was simply there, in the courtyard, in the plain leather and iron she had first seen him in, looking the way he always looked, attentive, unhurried, entirely himself. Stellan was on the courtyard steps with a cup of something warm and an expression of profound personal satisfaction. The silent third man, whose name was Ren, she had learned through correspondence, and who was Cassian's oldest friend and least talkative advisor, stood near the gate and nodded once in his precise way. You came, Cassian said. I told you I wasn't saying no, Alice said. He looked at her for a long moment with those pale, clear eyes, and what was in them was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter than either. The expression of a man looking at something he had believed in without requiring proof. and finding the proof arrive anyway, and being exactly as glad as he had known he would be. "Come in," he said. "I'll show you the library. It's the best room in the stronghold." "How many books?" Alice asked. "More than you can read in a year." "Then I'll need longer than a year," she said, and walked through the gate. She never returned to Alder's stronghold to serve. Sarah found her own footing in the Northern Territory, sharp-eyed, quick, useful in the ways that mattered, and the two of them built a life there that bore no resemblance to the one they had grown up in, and every resemblance to the one they had always deserved. Alice learned the Stone-Wild bloodline through letters and one long autumn visit, and the slow, honest work of understanding a mother through the shape of the life she had built and the choices she had made. She found grief there, and also pride, and also peace. Owen of Alder married Isolde of Greymere, and the alliance was everything it was supposed to be politically, and nothing more than that in any other sense. And he did not think about a wheat-colored dress as often as he had expected to, and then he did not think about it at all, which was its own kind of answer about what it had meant. Edric of Greymere receded from interpack politics gradually and without drama, the way wolves who have overplayed a hand sometimes did, and the packs he had spoken for found other arrangements. Cassian ruled the northern packs with the same precision and the same chosen restraint he brought to everything, and the compact held, and the 7 sub-packs renewed their fealty at the start of the following year as they always had, and the stronghold built into the cliff face stood as it had always stood, solid, earthed, impossible to take from the people who lived inside it. Alice stood with him at the renewal ceremony, in the great hall of Varenhold, before the 7 pack elders and their assembled wolves. She stood not as a server, and not as a bloodline artifact, and not as someone's discovery or someone's chosen, or someone's answer to a question about power and territory. She stood as herself, as a woman who had sewn a dress by candlelight and walked into a hall carrying hope and been broken open by what she found there, and who had walked toward an archway with her dignity intact and been stopped by a word that carried weight, as a woman who had taken the months she needed and made the choice she needed to make, in her own time, from her own wholeness. The ceremony ended, the hall filled with the noise of 7 packs, celebrating a compact renewed. Somewhere near the back, Stellan was already making friends with people he had never met, and Ren was watching the room with his arms crossed and his quiet eyes moving. Cassian stood beside Alice and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Outside, the northern forest stretched in every direction, old and green, and full of the kind of quiet that was not emptiness but its opposite. The deep-rooted silence of a living thing that had been here long before them and would be here long after, and did not need anything from them except to be left standing. Alice looked at it through the high window and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had put her there, because she had chosen it.